Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala ma ba'd. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. The Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam, as Shaykh Hassan mentioned the hadith, he said, سَبْعَةٌ يُظِلُّهُمُ اللَّهُ فِي ظِلِّهِ يَوْمَ لَا ظِلَّ إِلَّا ظِلُّهُ. The Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam said, there will be 7 people who will be given the shade on the day of judgment, on that day when there's no shade except the shade that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala provides. And he started the hadith, he said, Imamun Adil, he said, just ruler. The second category he mentioned, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, he says, Shabun nasha'a fi ibadatillah. He says, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, a youth who was brought up in the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that is the second category, second of 7 categories who will be shaded on this day of judgment, inshallah. Now, it's interesting that this hadith, as a personal thing, this is one of my favorite hadith ever. And in top 4, maybe you could say. And it's such a big blessing from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be able to speak about your favorite hadith. And interestingly, this section of the hadith is also my personal favorite, because it really is relevant to me more than any other section maybe. And I really hope to be from those people, inshallah. So the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam says, Shabun nasha'a fi ibadatillah. A youth who grew up in the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, before we begin in the detail, I'd like to mention the whole lecture is divided into 3 segments, right? The first one, we answer 3 questions to get the complete understanding of this category. The first one is that who is this youth who was brought up in the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? What are his characteristics? How do we define that individual? Right? Second question, why does this youth have a special status with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Like, why does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala choose this youth and give him special shade on the day of judgment? And number 3, what practical steps can we do to be amongst this category? Inshallah. So, the first one is, who is this young man or young woman who was brought up in the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Now, throughout the lecture, I'll be using the male gender or masculine words, but I'll be referring to both genders because it's just easier to speak with one gender. So, the word shab, it shares its linguistic origin with the word shabba. And they say, shabbatun nar ishti'aluha. They say, shabbatun nar, nar means fire. Shabbatun nar ishti'aluha means it's flames. And it's interesting to see, in Arabic language you would find words that share the same linguistic origin often end up having a connection within themselves in the terms of meaning. So for example, the word salah you have and the word sila. Right? These 2 words in Arabic, they share the same linguistic origin. And it's interesting to see both of these words have a connection between themselves in terms of meaning. So salah means prayer, right? Simple definition, salah means prayer. Sila means connection, right? So if you think of the link between the meaning connection and salah is, that salah is connecting to who? To Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? So you see in Arabic language, this is an interesting thing, that words that share the same linguistic origin, they have some sort of linkage between them in terms of the meaning. So the word shab shares the root word with, as we said, shabba. And we said shabbatun nar, meaning ishta'aluha. Ishta'al means the flames, right? So how does flames, how the flames of the fire, how does that share the meaning or some sort of relationship with the word shab, youth? That's the first question. And that is, a youth, a person, when we say he's youthful, is someone who is very adventurous in nature, right? He tries to take risks, and he's someone who's willing to try different things. And thus fire, touching the fire is risky as well. And the flames, being close to the fire is risky. Thus we can attach a meaning together with these words. That shab is someone who is willing to take risk in his life, and is willing to experience things that people above his age, older than his age, would not be able to do so or would not want to do so. The other word we find, shabban nar. The first one was shabbatun nar. This is shabban nar. This means awqadaha, to ignite fire. Again, how does igniting fire, or how does igniting have a connection with the youth? Now, igniting fire requires energy, right? In the beginning, you need the excitation energy that is requirement for the fire to exist. So the youth is someone, as we know, is filled with energy. It's filled with physical energy. Things that the youth can do, the older people are not able to do so. Either physically, even mentally, as the youth is more alert. You would see those who are driving cars, you would see the older people, let's say 65 and above, or 40, 50 and above people, compared to the younger ones, they are more alert to the changes of the traffic light. As soon as it becomes green, you see this young man on the side, he just presses the accelerator and boom, he goes. The older individual, unfortunately, takes a second and a half, maybe not a second, that's too much, maybe less than a second, and then maybe he presses and Bismillah, he goes, right? So that is the thing we find. So linguistically, we define youth, someone who is energetic, willing to take risk, adventurous, that is youth. Now the question is, what time period does the youth begin? The time period of youth is differed over, but in simplistic terms, someone who reaches the age of puberty to the age of around 33 years old, right? Around that age. So for the man, it would be maybe 13 to 33, that area. For the young woman, would be from a lesser age, maybe 9, 10 to 33 years old. That range of years, or that gap in time span, is called the youth period. So now the Prophet ﷺ says, "Shabun nasha fi ibadatillah." Now what does nasha'a mean? Nasha'a means to be brought up. It also means to cultivate, means to nourish. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses a word similar to nasha in the Quran in many places. And one of them, which is exciting and very interesting in our context, is in terms of plants and agriculture. Now, does it take a long time for the plants to grow or a short time? Long time, right? It takes a lot of effort for the plants to grow. The water comes, it's just not the seed. More effort is to be done, more considerations are to be taken, and then only you will have plants that would grow. Sometimes you will take care and the plants will not turn out right. So how do we link it back to the hadith now? Is that youth, this particular youth, is someone who is provided the environment to cultivate and grow in the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And thus the first lesson we find in this hadith is for the parents in the audience. Is that if you want your child to be of this category, it is number one, your responsibility. Many people think you can send your children to the Islamic school or any Islamic school. I'm not criticizing schools in this city, just generally saying. You could send them to any Sunday or Saturday school, and your responsibility of taking care of your child Islamically is shifted or lifted maybe, or decreased. And many parents who send their children to such schools become lackadaisical. But the reality is, you may not send your child to the Islamic school, but the main thing is that you provide your child with the environment at your house. And that's where it begins. And the responsibility goes back to the parents. Now, giving this introduction, what is growing up in the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mean now? We know what youth is, we know what nasha'a means. Now what is growing up in the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? That means basically the child or young man, a young woman is, number one, focusing on their obligations. So they perform the salawat, they fast in Ramadan. Number two, they learn how to read the Quran, not necessarily memorize. So this stuff most of us understand. The aspect which we miss is this child or this young man understands that his purpose of life is to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And thus you will see it's like an attitude. Being brought up in the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is like an attitude. The person who's brought up in the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you would see live a normal life, he'll go to school, university, get a job, get married. But if you summarize his life, you would say this is an individual who's brought up in the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He will have the manners that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants. He'll be nice with the parents, with the people. He will be polite. All holistic concept, not just restricted to memorizing the Quran or just one side of the ritualistic worship, right? It's a holistic concept. So that is your shab, the young man or young woman who is brought up in the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You would see in the seerah of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam, the companions of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam, a huge number of them, famous ones, are actually young men and young women, really young, some of them in their teens, some of them in the early 20s. Even Umar radiallahu anhu, as far as I remember, became Muslim late 20s, 27, 28, that area, that range. Right? And we find some of the famous companions, some of those companions who have the biggest impact in the Islamic history, you would find, especially in terms of spreading the knowledge, you'd find them very young. The first one you can come in mind is the wife of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That's Aisha radiallahu anha. Right? She was a young individual, brought up in the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Father is Abu Bakr, the second best man after the Prophets, and her husband is the best man amongst the humanity. Right? Brought up in the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You see the companions like Abdullah ibn Abbas radiallahu anhuma. He's the cousin of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. When the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam passes away, he's 13 years old only. And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam made special dua for him. He hugged him one day and he made special dua for him, and he asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give him the fiqh of the deen and to teach him the ta'wil, the interpretation of the Quran. And you would be amazed that almost every major book of tafsir is incomplete without the name of Abdullah ibn Abbas radiallahu anhuma and his opinions of tafsir. You'll find other companions, Abdullah ibn Umar radiallahu anhuma, slightly older than him, 5-6 years. He's the son of Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anh. He is famous for what? He is famous for narrating ahadith. And he's probably in the top 5-6 people who narrated the most ahadith in the collections of ahadith. One of my personal favorite companions, and currently my favorite new companion, if you would say, I learned about him recently myself, is Abdullah ibn Zubayr radiallahu anhuma. This is one interesting companion who was born in the first year of Hijrah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. If you read the books that teach you how to have khushu' in salah, or how amazing worship should be, or the worship of the Salaf, you would find the name of Abdullah ibn Zubayr radiallahu anhuma on those books. They say regarding him that his mother actually defined him to be qawwamul layl wa sawwamul nahar, someone who stands up the entire night in worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, wa sawwamul nahar, meaning the one who fasts a lot. He was known for fasting a lot. The young man, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam passes away, and he is merely 10 years old. His mother is Asma bint Abi Bakr, the daughter of Abu Bakr radiallahu anh. His father is Az-Zubayr radiallahu anh, the one given the glad tidings of paradise. So he's brought up in an Islamic household. So his grandfather from the mother's side, we said, is Abu Bakr. His grandmother from the father's side is Safiya bint Abil Muttalib, the aunt of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. His aunt is Aisha radiallahu anha, the wife of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. His uncle is who else than the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now you see he's surrounded by the environment, and thus we see, if you read his life story, you would find he becomes the Amir of the believers towards the end of his life, because he was brought up in the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Just one interesting narration about him. They said, one of the eyewitnesses, he says, we saw Abdullah ibn Zubayr go into ruku', and I read al-Baqarah, Ali Imran, wal-Nisa, wal-Ma'idah, and he was still in ruku'. And that is actually, if you look at the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ, that's emulating the Prophet ﷺ. You would find the Prophet ﷺ, a similar narration. He once stood up, and Abdullah ibn Abbas narrates this narration. He says, a young companion, as we said, he's praying with the Prophet ﷺ in Qiyam al-Layl or Tahajjud, and the Prophet ﷺ starts his salah. He reads al-Baqarah, al-Nisa in this particular order, and then Ali Imran. And that is in one rak'ah, by the way. That's not just in the whole night. That's one rak'ah. So this is the young man who was brought up in the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, moving on now, we know what is a youth who was brought up in the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We defined his characteristics. The second question comes in, why does this youth have a special status with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Right? This is the second question. The Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam says, Sunnah Tirmidhi, an authentic hadith, he says, لا تزول قدم ابن آدم يوم القيامة من عند ربه حتى يسأل عن خمس. The Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said, the feet of the Bani Adam, the son of Adam, will not move from from his Lord subhanahu wa ta'ala until he has been asked about 5 things. The first one he says, عن عمره فيما أفناه. In his life, the whole lifespan, how he spent it. And he sallallahu alaihi wasallam then says, وعن شبابه فيما أبلاه. And in his youth, regarding his youth, how he managed it. Right? Now the question is, isn't the youth part of the lifetime? And the answer is yes, right? Why did the Prophet ﷺ focus on the youth when he mentioned the entire lifetime? It just shows the importance of that period of time. And thus we find in our times, what are the youth mostly focused on and worried about? Either they're busy with entertainment, watching films, spending time with their friends excessively, listening to music, distracted by entertainment. That's one category, if you would say. The other category you would say is trying their best not to fall into zina and struggling with that, right? These two, you would say, are basically the most things that they're worried about the youth. That they're worried and they're distracted in these two things, in entertainment and in defiling their desires. This youth, the one we're focusing on, is living amongst his people. He's not a monk. He goes to school, he goes to university, he lives a regular life. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blessed this man or young woman to live amongst his people. And number one, to able to control his desires. And that is the theme you will see throughout the 7 people. The Imamun Adil, وَشَابٌ نَشَأَ فِي عِبَادَةِ اللَّهِ, and the other 5. You will see one common thing, that these people had the opportunity to misuse their position, right? The first thing I say, if I say leadership, what comes to mind? First word, maybe corruption, maybe injustice, right? If I say youth, what comes to mind? Someone who's distracted in his life, has no focus. But these people in this hadith, you would find, these people challenged the status quo, and they were able to live amongst the people and go against their peer pressure at that time. And thus Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala honored them on the Day of Judgment by giving him his shade on the day when there's no shade except the shade of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Conquering his desire was the first thing he did. On top of, and this is enough a challenge, right? For the youth and the audience, it is enough a challenge. The second thing he does is he makes his nafs love the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? He makes his nafs desire and worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala out of love and enthusiasm and zeal, not out of robotic nature. His nafs loves to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So he does 2 amazing things that most people at his age are not able to do so, right? And thus Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala honors him on the Day of Judgment. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَأَمَّا مَنْ خَافَ مَقَامَ رَبِّهِ وَنَهَى النَّفْسَ عَنِ الْهَوَى فَإِنَّ الْجَنَّةَ هِيَ الْمَأْوَى. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and he could see how it makes sense now. He says, وَأَمَّا مَنْ خَافَ مَقَامَ رَبِّهِ, and as for the one who is fearful in standing before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, his Rabb, وَنَهَى النَّفْسَ عَنِ الْهَوَى, and he controlled his nafs and prohibited his nafs from himself from following his desires. فَإِنَّ الْجَنَّةَ هِيَ الْمَأْوَى. For that individual who does so, his abode and ending is the paradise. So now we've seen the definition of shab, the young man who was brought in the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we've also seen why does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give him such honor on the Day of Judgment. The third thing we would see is, what can you and I do to be amongst this amazing elite group of people on the Day of Judgment, right? Knowing the honor Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives them, as Shaykh Hassan mentioned previously, either you're under the shade or you're not. So either you're part of this group of people or you're not. So why not try to be of this group of people? For those of us who can, some people in the audience, the age doesn't matter right now, the age is gone. But what you could do is for your children, and you could make this a goal for their life, that you want your son, you want your daughter to reach that status. Maybe you couldn't, but you will also get the ajr to ensure that your daughter or your son reaches that status. The first thing, if you want to achieve that status, is to sincerely ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for guidance. For those of us amongst us who come in that group of age, need to listen to this attentively. The first thing you need to do is to ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for guidance. Many people downplay the importance of dua, and they think their own actions reap results. The reality is, your own actions, if they're not guided by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you will not reap the correct results. And the only way to be guided from Allah, or to get guidance from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or one of the best ways rather, is to make dua to Him. Right? A person may be doing things, and many people we know, they start, they listen to a lecture and they have an iman boost, and then suddenly they start doing the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They're active in their community, they learn different things, they start applying. A time comes when they burn out. Right? Because they did not seek the guidance from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As the poet says, إِذَا لَمْ يَكُنْ مِنَ اللَّهِ عَوْنٌ لِلْفَتَى فَأَوَّلُ مَا يَقْضِي عَلَيْهِ اجْتِهَادُهُ. The poet says, if the young man does not get the support and assistance from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the first thing he will leave is doing his hard work. If you don't have the guidance from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the tawfiq from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the first thing you will lose is the hard work. And if you lose the hard work, you will go down the drain and the actions will go in the negative direction. The second thing we find, if you do not have a good companion or good company around yourselves, it will be very difficult to be part of these people. Because the group you're around, group you hang out with a lot in your school, in the university, outside, is that group will have a huge impact on you. The Prophet ﷺ says in hadith, in Sahihain, Sahih al-Bukhari, Saheeh Muslim, says, مَثَلُ الْجَلِيسِ الصَّالِحِ وَالْجَلِيسِ السُّوءِ كَمَثَلِ صَاحِبِ الْمِسْكِ وَكِيلِ الْحَدَّادِ. The Prophet ﷺ says, the example of a good companionship, a good gathering, and that of the bad companionship, bad gathering, is that the example of the one who sells perfume or musk, and the one who is, the Haddad is the blacksmith, right? Keel al-Haddad, you've probably seen on TV or some cartoon or something, there is someone who's always blowing on the fire with this type of instrument. I don't know what that is. That individual. So example is of good one, like the one who sells perfume, and the other one is the one who's blowing on the fire. The Prophet ﷺ continues, he says, لا يعدمك من صاحب المسك إما تشتريه أو تجد ريحه. The Prophet ﷺ says, you will not be deprived of anything if you stay with the one who sells musk or the perfume. Either you will purchase it from him, either you will go to his shop, you will purchase what you like and you get something good, or the least is you go, you don't like anything, or you find something which is $200, it's too expensive for you. At least you have the car that has a good smell with you, right? You go home with a good smell. As for the one, Prophet ﷺ continues, says, وَكِيلُ الْحَدَّادِ, the one who blows the bellows on the fire. He says, يُحْرِقُ بَدَنَكَ أَوْ ثَوْبَكَ أَوْ تَجِدُ مِنْهُ رِيحًا خَبِيثًا. The Prophet ﷺ says, as for the one who is blowing on the fire near the blacksmith, either you will get a flame and burn your body somewhat, or less than that, something will happen to your thawb, your clothing. Maybe a flame comes, boom, burns a part of it. Or the least of them all is that you will leave the gathering of this individual and you will not smell good, you smell foul. That's the least that can happen. Thus, a good companionship has a huge impact. The Prophet ﷺ also says in Sunan Abi Dawud, Hadith al-Sahih, he says, الرَّجُلُ عَلَى دِينِ خَلِيلِهِ فَلْيَنظُرْ أَحَدُكُمْ مَنْ يُخَالِلُ. The Prophet ﷺ says, an individual is on the deen of his khalil, his close friend. فَلْيَنظُرْ أَحَدُكُمْ مَنْ يُخَالِلُ. Then let one of you look whom he befriends in a very close fashion. You should look at that individual. Because if you have a best friend or close friend who is not worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who is not close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the reality is either you're similar to him, or until right now you're immune, but it'll affect you in the near future. And thus your iman will dip, because this individual you're hanging out with, his iman is also not high. The third thing we find is you try to keep yourself away from situations that would lead you to the decrease of your iman. Right, they say, al-bu'du an mawatin al-fitan. Keep yourself away from those situations. Cut off those, close those doors. One brother, I did a khutbah at the university a couple of weeks ago, I believe last week, not this Friday, the Friday before. And it's very nice brother, he comes up to me, he says, I have a small problem. I said, go ahead. He said, he's a foreign student, he came here studying from his country. He said, sometimes I feel the desire in me, the sexual desire going very high. A young boy, young man, maybe 19, 20 years old. And he says, what do you think I should do? And he's a very nice individual, very sincere. He says, you ask me any question, I'll tell you, because I need help. So, and this person, one of the first things I told him, or one of the few things I told him, and this is very important, subhanAllah, and this is a reminder for all of us, is that if you have, for example, Facebook, almost everyone who is teenager here and above has Facebook here, maybe even younger, the age has a Facebook account, probably Instagram, Snapchat, Twitter, social media essentially, right? If you have someone on your Facebook who shares inappropriate pictures, what you need to do, either unfriend them, or if you're too nice, don't unfriend them, just turn off their notifications, right? Close the gate. The more haram you're exposed to, number one, the more desensitized you become. And that is a problem, right? Close the gate to haram. Unfriend them, unlike some pages. For example, I had some, on my Facebook, I liked some pages, and the videos they would send were sometimes, I won't say like big problem, but they were like, if you watch them, some haram stuff inside. And alhamdulillah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guided me that the first thing I used to think, you know what, I can resist this. It's very easy, I can do this. In the beginning it was okay, sometime came, it became difficult. So the first thing I did then was, unlike the page. No longer those videos came on my page. Alhamdulillah, from that side at least, I've been safe for some time. Right? Close the gates. If you have some other ways of looking at haram, especially the sin of the eyes, because that opens the gates to other things. If you have any other means, either control them or close the gate totally. If you think Facebook is too much problem for you, maybe eliminate Facebook, maybe take a break from Facebook and see what happens. The last thing we find is that, and this is very interesting, subhanAllah, is that the youth, the individual, the young man or the young woman, after following all these advices, making dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, changing his companionship. Number 3, closing the gates to haram. The fourth thing he can do or she can do is that have a special worship that he loves very, very much, or he finds it easy to do. For example, in terms of worship, I mean is ritualistic worship, meaning reciting the Quran, or praying extra, or doing adhkar, or fasting in voluntary fasts. Any of these things. Find something which you have taste to, which you love more than the other things. Other than your obligations, I'm saying, right? You pray your obligations, you do your obligations. Other than your obligations, find something which you love very much. Right? Some of the companions you find, they would love to read the Quran, and they would not be able to, maybe let's say a fast, and they would say, fasting would make me weak. Like Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiallahu anhu is famous for this. He said, fasting makes me weak, and it diverts me from, voluntary fasting, right? Not Ramadan. Voluntary fasting makes me extra weak, and it takes me away from Qiyam al-Layl and recitation of the Quran. So you focus on one thing which is only known to you and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Keep it between you and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because that induces sincerity within you. And the more sincere you are, and because you made dua in the beginning, it's like a cycle. The more sincere you are, the more dua you will make, the more it will be accepted, and the easier it will become for you to maybe get good company around you, to get rid of bad company, and also to control yourself and close the gates. There's an interesting story which is mentioned in the books of history, which is regarding the last point. Choosing a worship which you are best at, or very good at, or you find easier to do than other things. For me personally, I find fasting to be very difficult. It's hard for me to be hungry for a long time. Unless it's wajib, I'll do so. But voluntary fasting is very difficult for me. So you choose what is easy for you. If fasting is easy, go ahead. A great man, a great worshipper and abid, he sent a message to Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala. Imam Malik, as you know, was the scholar of Medina. And he sent him a message saying, Ya Imam, come with me and we'll worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Leave the gatherings of people as they distract you. Come with me and we worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Imam Malik rahimahullah, he sent a letter to this individual. Essentially message, if you would like to say. He sent a letter and he said, and very polite, mashallah, he said, you know, O Imam, that you know I love seeking knowledge and I love teaching knowledge. And you love to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you love to pray, you love to fast. Again, we're talking about voluntary fasting, voluntary acts of worship, right? Extra, more than the obligatory stuff. So he says, Imam Malik says, you know, you love to fast, you love to pray, and I love to learn and teach Islam. It's not that Imam Malik wouldn't fast outside Ramadan, he would. But that was not maybe his stronger point. Maybe his stronger point was learning and teaching the deen. So he says to this man, you know what? This is your strength, this is my strength, and both are good things. And for some people, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَرُبَّ رَجُلٍ فُتِحَ لَهُ فِي بَابِ الصَّلَاةِ وَلَمْ يُفْتَحْ لَهُ فِي الصِّيَامِ. He says, for some person maybe, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala opens the door for him and makes it easy for him to do voluntary fasting, and not easy for him to, for example, pray extra salawat, or vice versa. For me, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made seeking knowledge and teaching it easy. And for you, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made fasting and performing extra salawat easy. So you do what you are good at, and I shall do what I am good at, and both of us are actually seeking the worship of the face of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that is how it is. You do what you are good at. Find something. And reading the Quran probably is the most easiest thing ever, right? You can finish a page of Quran, 500 letters approximately, 5,000 ajr minimum, in probably 2 minutes. Forget tajweed, I'm not talking about tajweed, just simple recitation. 5,000 ajr per 2 minutes. So if you look at the rate, 2,500 ajr per minute. That's a lot of ajr. Fasting may not have that much ajr for you, right? So find something that is appealing to yourself and easy for yourself to be part of this special category of people. As the Prophet ﷺ says, وَشَابٌ نَشَأَ فِي عِبَادَةِ اللَّهِ سُبْحَانَهُ وَتَعَالَى, a youth who was brought up and he grew up in the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَقُولُوا قَوْلِي هَذَا وَاسْتَغْفِرُ اللَّهَ لِي وَلَكُمْ وَلِسَائِرِ الْمُسْلِمِينَ وَالْمُسْلِمَاتِ فَاسْتَغْفِرُوهُ إِنَّهُ هُوَ الْغَفُورُ الرَّحِيمُ.